Today we're going to talk about how theory is used in research. Specifically, we'll focus on philosophical worldviews. I'm Meredith Vanstone. So theory is important, but it's also pretty challenging, and today we're just going to be really skimming the surface of a topic that scholars have dedicated entire careers to. It's called the philosophy of science. The key points that I want you to take away from today's lecture are that first, there are different ways of thinking about the world, and that these worldviews, which are sometimes called paradigms, are really important to your research project. The paradigm that you use affects the questions that you ask, it affects the type of data that you gather and how you gather it, and how you interpret or analyze that data. I also want you to understand the main delineations between some of the most common or the biggest paradigms. Some of these ideas are complex, and they may be confusing if this is the first time that you're encountering them. I encourage you to keep your mind open, keep listening, and then explore some of the additional resources that I will suggest at the end. This content is really important for rigorous research, and it's especially important if you are planning on using a qualitative approach. So here's a metaphor that I'm going to come back to in a later lecture. I tend to think of research project as a collection of elements that all need to work together. And there can be some mixing and matching between elements, but there's some elements that are just incongruent with each other that cannot be used together in a rigorous way. We'll talk more about this in further lectures on qualitative research, but today we're talking about one element in your research toolkit, the philosophical worldview or paradigm. Your paradigm affects all the other choices that you make in your research, whether it's the kind of approach to use, what methodology or study design you pick, what data collection methods, and what analytical techniques you use. Before we begin, a short note on terminology. So, like many other aspects of research, there's a lot of different words used for very similar and sometimes overlapping concepts. The ideas that we're talking about today have been discussed by many authors using a variety of different names. While there are slight variations between the different terms that authors use, for our introductory purposes, they're interchangeable. I tend to use the word paradigm just because it's less of a mouthful than philosophical worldview or epistemological worldview. Thomas Kuhn, who's a famous philosopher of science, defined a paradigm as the underlying assumptions and intellectual structure upon which research and development in a field of inquiry is based. The key part of this definition is underlying assumptions and intellectual structure. So just hold that definition in your mind throughout the rest of the lecture. If you're interested in reading more of Kuhn's work, and I would encourage you to if the philosophy of science is something that you're interested in, or if you plan to go on to further graduate study, I've provided a reference for this at the end. Okay, so what is a paradigm? A paradigm is a set of assumptions that act as a frame of reference within which we all operate. And even if you've never heard the word paradigm before, or you've never considered this idea, you still have a paradigm, you still have a particular worldview, and you use it to interpret all your experiences within the world every day. You just maybe have never sat back and questioned your assumptions, questioned the way that you think about how the world works or why it works this way. But welcome to graduate school. This is what we do here. Part of being a researcher is recognizing the assumptions that you have and the way that those assumptions affect the way that you conduct research, the way that you understand research, the way that you think the world operates, and how you live within it. Your paradigm also affects the questions that you ask, the people that you study, and the way that you interpret their responses. So in short, a paradigm is the way that you see the world, and it's really hard to sort of see beyond that or see outside of it. So I've given you a picture of a goldfish in a bowl here, and the water is sort of the metaphor for a paradigm, that he might be aware of the boundaries of this, of his world, but it's hard to see the sort of what he's swimming in. And if you've never thought of these questions before, well, sometimes it's hard to see that there's an alternative way of thinking about the way that the world works. It's hard to step outside your own understandings of what the world is, what exists, what the limits of knowledge are, and what counts as truth. So I mentioned before that a paradigm is a package of different beliefs. Denzin and Lincoln, who are two very prolific writers on qualitative research, have described three different categories of belief about the world. These are three interrelated ideas that support every other aspect of your research. And those three categories of belief are ontology, epistemology, and methodology. So we're going to talk about them one by one, and I've used kind of a silly example to help this stick in your mind, to help you sort of see the difference and remember the difference between these three categories, but we'll talk about how they apply to research as well. So the first category is ontology. Ontology is the study of being. So your Since ontology is the study of being, your ontological assumptions are assumptions about what exists or what's real. When we look between paradigms, as we will in a few minutes, the main difference is belief in either one singular reality or more than one subjective reality. But let's just hold on to that and we'll come back to this idea. To help you remember that ontology is about being and existence, we'll think about looking for Bigfoot. First, we have to determine whether or not we think he exists, or whether he might exist, if this is even a possibility in our worldview of what exists in this world. In other words, is it even worth looking for Bigfoot? A difference in ontology on this issue will determine whether or not we even want to proceed with the investigation. So I think Guba and Lincoln do a really good job summarizing this. Here's a quote from page 21 of their article, and I've provided the reference at the end of the lecture. I'd highly recommend that you read this book chapter. So Guba and Lincoln say that ontology is about the form and the nature of reality, and therefore what can be known about reality. For example, if a real world is assumed, then what can be known about it is how things really are and how things really work. Then only those questions that relate to matters of real existence or real action are admissible or valid. Other questions, such as those concerning matters of aesthetic or moral significance, fall outside the realm of legitimate scientific inquiry. In other words, you have to have an understanding of what exists in the world to know what's sort of legitimate, say, to investigate or to study. The second category is epistemology. Epistemology is the study of knowledge. Specifically, epistemology asks questions about what we can know, how we can know whatever it is that we can know, what does it mean to have knowledge, who can have knowledge, what can be known or what we can have knowledge about. Epistemology is also interested in questions about the authority of knowledge, about what kind of knowledge is valid or reliable, what the limits of that knowledge are, and what the relationship is between the knower and the known. So, back to our Bigfoot example. If we've decided that Bigfoot might exist in this world, then we need to start thinking about how we will know whether or not he does exist. How will we gain this knowledge about his existence? So we need to think about what would count as authoritative knowledge on this question. Say we are presented with this picture, a photograph of Bigfoot riding an ATV. We have to assess if this knowledge is reliable. Just because we see a picture of something, does that mean that we know it? Is a picture a valid form of knowledge? Are there other things going on in the picture that either increase the reliability or decrease the reliability of that knowledge? And perhaps most centrally, how can we differentiate what is true from what is not true? So back to Guba and Lincoln. On page 22 of their article, they say that epistemology is the nature of the relationship between the knower and the would-be knower and what can be known. The answer that can be given to this question is constrained by the answer already given to the ontological question. That is, not just any relationship can now be postulated. So if, for example, a real reality is assumed, then the posture of the knower must be one of objective detachment or value freedom in order to be able to discover how things really are or how things really work. So what they're trying to say here is that if we hold that there is one singular reality that is the same for everybody, that everybody experiences reality in the same way, then in order to gain knowledge about that reality, we need to consider how we are going to pursue that knowledge in an objective or in a detached way. These things go both ways. Just as Guba and Lincoln say, your epistemological assumptions depend on the answer that you gave to the ontological question, or your epistemological assumptions depend on your ontological assumptions, so too do your ontological assumptions depend on your epistemological instructions. They're interrelated, they interact with each other, and there needs to be a congruency between the two sets of beliefs, or the three sets of beliefs once we include methodology. And this is sometimes what trips up novice researchers, is they might be interested in investigating a phenomenon that they believe everybody experiences differently, depending on their own subjective experience or situation in the world, but then they might try to investigate that taking an objective neutral stance, trying to control for confounding factors and all that kind of stuff. But this is incongruent. Your ontology and your epistemology, they have to match, they have to work together. And the third category of belief is methodology. So just a quick note on terminology. In qualitative research, we often use the word methodology to refer to different strategies or different traditions of research inquiry. But in this topic about epistemological paradigms, worldviews, they use methodology just a little bit differently. In this context today, methodology is about how we know something or how information can be obtained. It's not about a particular set or strategy of inquiry. It's not about grounded theory or narrative inquiry or the type of topics, the type of methodologies that we'll be discussing later in this course. So epistemology and methodology are quite similar. They're both about knowledge. Epistemology is concerned with the nature of knowledge, and methodology is concerned with how that knowledge is obtained. And because these are ideas that are so close or so similar, it's hard to completely extricate them from each other. So back to our Bigfoot example, so we've already said that we think Bigfoot might exist, and we have some ideas about what evidence or what type of knowledge we'll need to verify his existence. So then the methodology is about how we are going to gain that knowledge. So if we don't think we can rely on grainy photos of Bigfoot riding an ATV, well, what can we rely on? What can we do to gain knowledge that we think will be authoritative? What techniques or tools or approaches might we use to determine whether or not Bigfoot exists? Back to Guba and Lincoln. So about methodology, they write, how can the inquirer go about finding out whatever he or she believes can be known? The answer to this is constrained by the answers already given to the first two questions. That is, not just any methodology is appropriate. For example, a real reality pursued by an objective inquirer mandates control of possible confounding factors. The methodological question cannot be reduced to a question of methods. The methods must be fit to a predetermined methodology. So it's back to that idea that your three categories of belief, your ontology, your epistemology, and your methodology, need to work together. They need to be congruent with each other. Oftentimes, novice researchers begin by selecting their methods without realizing that each method carries with it a set of other assumptions. If you select an experimental methodology, then you're also choosing a particular set of ontological and epistemological beliefs, that there is a singular reality to be known, and that the researcher must be objective in order to gain that knowledge. So do you see how these three elements sort of build on each other? First, we start out with what's out there that can be known, which narrows our options for how we can know about that thing, which further narrows our options about how we might acquire this information. So I've sort of made this pyramid or this directional relationship where ontology is on the bottom, epistemology is in the middle, and then methodology is the final piece at the top. And we'll come back to this idea. So now we're going to talk about some of the key philosophical worldviews, otherwise known as paradigms. As with many other topics and ideas in research, the boundaries between these paradigms is not hard and fast. Many authors draw the boundaries slightly differently. I'll try to introduce a few other terms for these paradigms to give you some keywords to draw on if you want to look for more information on your own. Here's how these four paradigms are sort of related to each other. So I've tried to lay them out to show the relationship between the different paradigms. I've drawn a spectrum here which will represent ontological assumptions. And this makes sense because ontology is the foundation of our knowledge pyramid. It restricts the rest of our choices. The divide between ontologies is one of the main separations between qualitative and quantitative research. However, like everything else in research, it's not 100% black and white. There's not a hard, fast boundary between qualitative and quantitative. There's lots of gray area. And that's why I've represented this as a spectrum, because there's a wide variety of belief, although they sort of tend towards either the qualitative or the quantitative pole. On one side of the ontological spectrum, the side most commonly associated with quantitative research, is the belief of one singular reality, or one truth. Right and wrong, the same world, and the same truth for every person. Some names for worldviews at this end of the spectrum are scientism, foundationalism, objectivism, realism. On the other side of the spectrum, the side which is most commonly associated with qualitative research, is the belief in multiple realities or multiple truths. Now, we're not getting into science fiction, hole in the universe, other side of the wardrobe stuff here. When I talk about multiple realities, the emphasis is on the contextual and perspectival nature of reality. It's the idea that I experience the world and act in a different way from you for a variety of factors, that my perspective or understanding of what's real relies on my own experiences, which may be shaped by where and how I grew up, my education, as well as things about me that shape the way that others in the world react to me. For instance, my gender, my physical appearance, the way I present myself, etc. So someone who's lived a much different life than I have may have a completely different experience of the world. And when we say that there are multiple realities or multiple truths, we're really talking about the different ways that we experience the world. In the middle of the spectrum, I've placed the pragmatic and advocacy approaches. These approaches can move farther or closer to each pole depending on how they're used, by whom, and for what purpose. So positivism or post-positivism are two closely related worldviews which are most associated with quantitative research. They posit that there's one objective reality which is independent of our experience and can be accessed through careful thinking, observing, and recording of experience. Correspondingly, positivist research aims to explain, predict, and control. Methods strive towards reducing uncertainty to produce knowledge which can be generalized and duplicated. Constructivism, and there's another very closely related paradigm called constructionism, hold that reality is socially constructed and that each person has a different experience of reality, shaped by social factors. Constructivist approaches recognize the role of the researcher in the research, including the questions that the researcher chooses to ask, the way that they design the study, the impact of their personal features and experiences on the collection and the interpretation of data. A constructivist approach commonly explores the way that people interpret and make sense of their experiences. Interpretivism shares many features with constructivism in terms of its ontological belief that one's experience defines reality and that there are multiple ways of experiencing the world. The goal of interpretivist research is to understand the meaning that individuals ascribe to their actions and experience, and interpretivist research generally concerns everyday lives and actions. So these two paradigms, constructivism and interpretivism, are very similar. There's slight nuances between the two, and I think that the main difference as far as you might be concerned, particularly those of you who are going to do qualitative approaches for your research, is that some qualitative methodologies tend to call it interpretivism, others call it constructivism, and so that can be a good guide in terms of what you might want to call it. But really they are quite similar, just sort of a different emphasis or different nuance on their understandings. Pragmatism is ontologically located somewhere between the one truth and the multiple truths side of the spectrum, and it holds that while there may be only one natural or physical reality, there may be multiple psychological and social realities. A pragmatist holds that knowledge is both constructed and based on an objective reality, and that the ontological position should be chosen according to the topic of study. Pragmatism can be very useful if you're doing a mixed methods research where you're trying to combine both quantitative and qualitative approaches, but you don't need to feel that if you don't choose pragmatism, then you are denying the existence of a natural or a physical reality. So the fourth paradigm that Creswell discusses is advocacy and participatory approaches. Advocacy and participatory approaches take the view that research should be conducted with the purpose of making change, and so it often must be entwined with a political agenda to do this. Advocacy and participatory approaches often use critical theories, such as Marxist, feminist, or queer theory, and they use these theories to draw attention to which marginalized groups may need study or which issues should be addressed. Advocacy and participatory approaches often focus on issues of empowerment, inequality, oppression, as they're applied to marginalized groups of people. Within this approach, researchers usually, or perhaps should, strive to use a collaborative approach and remove the hierarchy between themselves and the participants. One of the most important aims of advocacy or participatory research is to provide a voice for the participants and to effect positive change in their lives. So how do you choose a paradigm? So I'll remind you now that positivism is usually associated with quantitative research, and constructivism and interpretivism are usually associated with qualitative research. Pragmatism tends to be used in mixed methods research, and advocacy and participatory approaches can be used in either quantitative or qualitative research. Part of choosing a paradigm is thinking about what kind of question you want to answer and about the topic that you want to study. Start by thinking about your topic and ask yourself what exactly it is that you are trying to study and what phenomena is at play. Is this phenomena something that everyone experiences differently? Or is it something which is relatively stable across different contexts? You also might want to think about why you want to study this phenomena. How will you use the knowledge generated by your research? So here's a tip. If you're doing quantitative research, most of your work is done for you, you're probably going to pick a positivist, post-positivist paradigm. The exception to this is perhaps if your research aims to give voice or empower the group that you are researching or that you're working with to create this research knowledge, then you might gravitate towards an advocacy participatory paradigm. If you're doing qualitative or a mixed methods project, your task is a little bit more difficult. One way of tackling this question of what paradigm to use is to look and see what paradigm your qualitative methodology uses. Be aware that some qualitative methodologies are used in different ways with different paradigms with different authors. So for example, grounded theory is a very common qualitative methodology, and there's a group of scholars that use it with a constructivist paradigm and a group of scholars that use it with an objectivist or post-positivist paradigm. And we'll talk more about this in the lecture on qualitative approaches and methodologies. Here's an online module that was created by the University of Southampton that helps you choose what paradigm works best for your project. It sort of leads you through a few questions, and you might find it helpful. So here are some points to ponder from today's lecture. What do you think is the nature of reality? How will that affect the choices that you make when doing research? Can two different paradigms ever be combined? For instance, can a positivist and a constructivist work together on a mixed methods research project? What challenges might they face?